This is Karima Alavi again, and we are going to continue our exploration of the links between Islamic scholarship and the European Renaissance. In part one, we looked at the Eastern scholars and the development of the Beit al-Hikmah, or the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. We're moving on now to part two, where we are going to look at the European scholars and those people who became very involved in the translation movement and transferred this knowledge from the East to the West via places like Sicily and Spain, and some people even worked in the northern part of Europe as well, before the huge grand translation movement of Spain and Sicily started. And as I said, at the spread of Islamic learning into Europe, and ask ourselves the question of how was this transmitted? How was this knowledge transmitted? So this is the Alhambra, of course, in Granada, Spain. So let's take a look at some of the things that we're going to be covering, sort of like a where are we headed kind of thing. And in 750, the Umayyad dynasty in Baghdad was overthrown by the Abbasids. That was a pretty important point in history, because what's going to happen is that when they are overthrown by the Abbasids, the only surviving Umayyad prince, Abdurrahman I, is going to flee to Spain because they have family over there. Arab scholarship quickly begins to appear in Europe through Sicily and Spain in particular, and again also making its way to Britain and Northern Europe, involving England, France, and Germany. Monks are going to begin translating and studying these manuscripts. Keep in mind that monks sort of had they were the places where the centers of reading and writing were. They were the people who ran the scriptoriums, and so the monks were the ones who were the literate ones primarily. There were other people who were literate, and there were monks who were illiterate, but most of the literacy was really focused in the scriptoriums within the churches and in the monasteries. In the year 830 in Baghdad, the Abbasids created the House of Wisdom. We looked at that at the last PowerPoint. And they bring scholars in to gather scientific knowledge from across the known world, really. Let's keep in mind the Crusades, 11th to 13th century. They increased the desire for Eastern goods and for Eastern manuscripts, scientific manuscripts coming in from the East. One of the things we'll be looking at in particular would be the beginning of the Reconquista, or the reconquering of Spain by the Catholics. That really kicks off in 1085. Because what happens there is the fall of Toledo to the Catholics, and the Catholics are going to unite and eventually expel or convert the Muslims and the Jews from Spain. Also in 1085, after the fall of Toledo, you've got Bishop Raimundo, and he's going to create something called the Toledo School of Translation. And now the effort to translate Arabic scientific knowledge is going to become a massive effort, bringing about a lot of changes into Europe. And then 1258, the Abbasid dynasty is actually going to fall to the Mongols. Of course, it's not going to be a pretty picture. And many of the scholars are going to flee to the West. They're going to go into Europe and take their manuscripts with them. And in the 15th century, you've got a lot of things happening. You've got the fall of Constantinople to the Turks. We'll look at how that affects Spain. Isabella and Ferdinand are going to take Granada in 1492. Columbus is going to sail to the New World. We'll see the expansion of European powers to the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and India. And you end up seeing what most schools most books call the Age of Exploration. I also like to talk about how it is also the age of exploitation as well. Okay. Let's look at the East and the West and how they compare. One of the problems that happens is a lot of times people focus on what's happening in the East with Baghdad and the Abbasid dynasty rising and sending the Umayyad prince, the last Umayyad prince to the west, but they kind of forget to look at Spain. So since we've already gone through a lot of this, let's look at Baghdad and the Abbasid dynasty. It starts in 750 and it ends in 1258 when the Mongols attack. And again, what's important about them is a house of wisdom in 830. In Spain, you've got Muslim rule from 756 to 1492. The most powerful, one of the earliest, most powerful leaders is Abdurrahman I, 756 to 788. And this one's important, Abdurrahman III, 912 to 961. And again, we'll look at him in more detail. But what's important about him is that he starts to trickle in more scholars. And so even before the Mongol attack in 1258, you've got Abdurrahman bringing in scholars already in the 10th century. And then you've got what's called the Taifa kings, a period where the unity amongst the Muslims is going to sort of crumble and fall apart, which just absolutely opens up the gate for the reconquering of Spain by the Christians, by the Catholics. We're going to look at the legacy of Al-Andalusian Spain in particular today, because it has repercussions in Europe in terms of crops and science, philosophy and religion, the development of European universities and their curriculum, and world exploration, and then also material goods, what people call the Islamic art of gracious living. In fact, you're kind of looking at a picture of it right now on the right. And of course, a lot of the crops are going to be coming into Spain from the New World. So there's going to be a lot of changes happening. The first Umayyad, or the last surviving prince of the Umayyad dynasty in Baghdad after the Abbasid attack, the one that was left, was Abdurrahman I. He ruled from 756 to 788. And one of the things that's interesting, if you look at Elmer Bendiner's book, The Rise and Fall of Paradise, of course, this is the Great Mosque of Cordoba you're looking at here. But here's a quote I like from him, because it's important to point this out to your students. Most Christians were converted to the curled slipper, the white tunic, the style, language, tastes, and in some cases, religion of Islam. And he managed, meaning Abdurrahman I, he managed to put to good use the Jews as technicians, artisans, and sophisticated agents for the transnational osmosis, that's an important expression there, of diverse civilizations of the Mediterranean world. So you're starting to see a more interconnected world at this point as well. One of the things that's kind of interesting here, of course, is it talks about the ease with which Muslim culture, not necessarily the religion, spread through Spain. Keep in mind that during his reign, 99% of the population was not Muslim. They were primarily Catholics. We'll look now at the golden age of Spain under Abdurrahman III, 912 to 961. He gave himself two titles that are kind of interesting. He gave himself the title Commander of the Faithful, and then he also called himself the Caliph of all the Islamic world. One of the Caliph of Islam. And one of the reasons I have over here, why would he do such thing? It's because he can. The Abbasid dynasty that had overthrown his family, the Umayyads, in Baghdad, by now sort of crumbling and not doing well. They're falling apart themselves. So he knows that he can claim to be the ruler of all of Islam and get away with it perfectly well, because the Caliph in Baghdad is losing power. So while we're in Spain, what's happening at this time is you're getting what's really called sort of a glorious material culture, an influx of a lot more Arabic scientific manuscripts than before, stronger links with Northern Europe and other parts of the world, and trade items start to move in pretty quickly. So you've got, this is going to feed Europe's desire for luxury goods from the East. And when I say the East, I'm talking about India, China, Persia, Baghdad. And in the 10th century, Cordoba was actually one of the biggest cities in the world that had a population of 500,000. If you look at McDougall Lytell's world history books, I found in there, I looked up what was the population of Paris at this time, and it was 38,000. So quite different. Again, keep in mind that this is also a time of a lot of influx of scientific materials as well. I wanted to talk about time and the importance of calculating time. This cannot be really, it can't be exaggerated at all. It was extremely important. It was one of the most critical tools for performing religious duties. Keep that in mind for all faiths. It's the ability to accurately mark time. Muslims, Jews, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, they all have religious activities, including prayers, but other things, but are meant to take place at a certain point, either in the day or in the evening. And of course, if you look at it on a larger scale, there are feast days, pilgrimages, and other events where you have to have a calendar rather than a clock to calculate these things. So we're going to look at the year 1582, because in Europe, what happens in 1582, the Europeans realized that their calendar was completely inaccurate. It was based on the calendar made by Julius Caesar, who made a calendar in 46 BCE that consisted of 445 days. And as the centuries passed, the calendar was so off the mark that Easter, and keep in mind, this is a celebration of the resurrection of Christ, and it takes place in the spring. And it finally got to the point where Easter wasn't even in the spring anymore. So in the 16th century, Pope Gregory VIII decided that the dates of Christ's birth and resurrection were important enough that they really need to be set into a proper calendar. Hence, we have what we call now the Gregorian calendar. And he gathered together scholars, including Copernicus, and said, I want you to select the most accurate star charts available, and we're going to base the calendar on that. So they studied different star charts, and they came up with a 15th century Muslim ruler of Samarkand by the name of Ulugh Beg, and he was the grandson of Tamerlane. And he had built an astronomical observatory in 1429 in Central Asia. And he had the most accurate charts of the heavens at that time. So the Gregorian calendar was redesigned to be more accurate. What's interesting is that it was introduced into Europe on Friday, October 15th, 1582, the day after Thursday, October 4th, 1582. So there are 10 days missing there. And it's kind of fun to ask your students to find something that happened, like pick a date, October 10th, 1582, find something that happened. They can't, because it didn't, at least in Europe, because it didn't exist. Just as vexing for these people were the marking of hours. It was a serious problem because it was linked to the performance of prayers and therefore to the salvation of one's soul. So the rule of Saint Benedict, for example, had divided the 24-hour daily cycle into 8 sets of prayers. So they divided the day into 8 parts. And they had candles that would burn down that would say, okay, it's time for the next prayer. They even used water clocks, and they created a new sundial that marks the day into 8 different sections, or what they called tides, while forgetting that seasonal changes in the movement of the sun are going to make a mess of this calculation pretty quickly. So the whole issue wasn't really settled until the development of the Gregorian calendar. And then that settled the problem of time and dates. But keep in mind, another tool that came to use that was quite important was the astrolabe. Some people saw it as an instrument of magic. They lobbed accusations at mathematicians in particular, and this went all the way to the top of the church hierarchy. We will look at a pope, Sylvester II, who was accused of being a magician because of his mathematical skills. And he was also considered to be in league with the devil because he was so good at doing math. So the astrolabe, while it was helpful, was not accepted right away. It was very much a suspect tool to be used. Okay, let's look at the next slide. Medieval Europe reacting to Islam, positive and negative both. This is, by the way, is a medieval painting of Muhammad preaching. Apparently he put the Quran on the head of an ox and preached from there. I'm not sure who came up with that idea, but that's Muhammad preaching to the people. Primarily, there were 4 negative themes that showed up in the writing in medieval Europe. And one of the things that they said was that Islam is a falsehood and a deliberate twisting of religious truth. Islam is a violent religion of the sword. This, of course, would come from the Crusades, forgetting the fact that it was a war and both people were fighting. That's what war's all about. It said that this is a religion of self-indulgence, particularly in sexual terms. So lots of fantasies about what's going on behind locked doors there. And then Muhammad is an agent of Satan. And they also saw it, I think wisely, actually, as a challenge to Christianity as a cultural phenomenon as well, not only religious. And the other attitude was, they have cool stuff that we want to buy. Right here, you can look at 2 of the predominant positive attitudes towards Islam. One of them was, as I called it, the Islamic art of gracious living, really fed into the fantasies of the artists and the writers. You've got a painting here called Entering the Garden Palace by Rudolf Ernst. All the way up to the 20th century, what one would call Orientalist paintings were still appearing in Europe and other parts of the world. But then also the study of Islamic manuscripts. That's another thing, that Islamic scholarship and manuscripts from the East became quite important. Here's a great quote that I really like. Really, all Christendom would be supplied for a year with the merchandise of Damascus. So this person's talking about just one city. There are such rich and noble and delicate works of every kind that if you had the money and the bone of your leg, without fail, you would break it to buy of these things. So a little bit of a hyperbole there, but yeah, it does set the tone. It lets you see what the tone was. And by the way, this is written by someone who was from Florence and traveled to the Middle East in the 14th century. Keep in mind, one of the major trade items was books, though. Excuse me. I wanted to talk about status through Islamic scholarship. They used the expression studia Arabum, or the study of the Arabs and studying Arabic scholarship. This became quite important and quite popular. And so people would send their sons down to the southern part of Europe, to Spain in particular, and they would study and translate documents and manuscripts and then bring them back up into Northern Europe. We'll look at Bishop Alvaro of Cordoba. He was one of the people who saw Islam as a cultural and intellectual threat. So this is a quote from him. Many of my co-religionists read the poems and stories of the Arabs and study the writings of Mohammedans, theologians, and philosophers, not in order to refute them, but to learn to express themselves most eloquently and correctly in the Arabic tongue. Alas, all the young Christians who became notable for their talents know only the language and literature of the Arabs, read and study Arabic books with zeal and at enormous costs from great libraries, and everywhere proclaim aloud that their literature is worthy of admiration. So again, keep in mind that Islam is seen as a material, a political, a military, and an intellectual threat. So there's a lot going on underneath those comments. What happens is the Taifa period, a period of what they call petty kingdoms, starts in 1031. After the death of Abdurrahman III, there's a series of weaker Muslim rulers. And so the Muslims start fighting amongst themselves, and they lose their unity completely. Not completely, but they lose their unity to the point where the Christians are able to unite, particularly under Alfonso VI of Spain, who's going to unite Castile and Leon, and he is going to declare himself emperor of the two faiths. One of the reasons he does this is that he ends up taking over a lot of the Muslim kingdoms, little petty tiny kingdoms, and he actually gives them the freedom to practice their religion, and he starts to appreciate their culture and their learning and their language. And so what he's going to do is sort of set the tone for a long line of Alfonsos. There's King Alfonsos who become scholar kings. and their relationship with Islam, so that they're going to defeat the Muslims, but they're also going to try to learn from them. In 1085, this is a big turning point, the fall of Toledo to Alfonso VI. And one of the things that he did was he actually started to spread the power of the Catholic Church and the Catholic Spaniards through Spain by basically gobbling up a variety of different small kingdoms. Toledo was not small. That was the big one. So one of the Arab scholars wrote a poem that said, "Men of Andalusia, put spurs to your horses. Delay at this time is idle folly. Garments usually tear at the hem, but Spain has been ripped right down the center." So we're going to look at three primary paths of transmission here. And one of the things to keep in mind that kind of fits into the path of transmission is the fact that Alfonso VI, the king that we were just looking at, the Spanish king, as a child, he was tutored by a monk by the name of Raimundo. And under Alfonso's leadership, the monk Raimundo was elevated to Archbishop of Toledo. And he developed something called the Toledo School of Translation. And that's going to be really important because Bishop Raimundo is going to direct Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars in a translation movement. And one of the things that's kind of interesting is that Alfonso VI decided that he wanted the translators to focus on mathematics, algebra, and astronomy. And Raimundo was completely in agreement with him. So it was due to these efforts that Toledo is going to rise as the first center of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish learning. So we're going to look at lay people. Excuse me, I'll call them independent scholars. Adelard of Bath, Gerard of Cremona are the big names that you're going to hear often. And then Leonardo Fibonacci and Michael Scott. And then we're going to look at the great scholar kings of Europe, Roger of Sicily, his grandson Frederick II of Sicily, and Alfonso the Wise, who is Alfonso X, not the 6th. Then we're going to move on to scholars within the church, and we're going to look at Gerbert of Aurillac, who's going to become Pope Sylvester II, Peter the Venerable, and Robert of Ketton. Keeping in mind, excuse me, as I said, that Toledo's fall in 1085 is going to kind of kick off a lot of this stuff. So here's the 4 lay people we're going to look at when we're discussing the rise of European intellectuals. So we will begin with Adelard of Bath. This is the cover of his translation of Euclid's Geometry. And Euclid's Geometry, as I'd said in an earlier lecture, was one of the most important books because when it was translated and brought up to the north by Adelard of Bath, one of the things it did is it's going to revolutionize architecture. And you're going to see the development of the great cathedrals of Europe. And it's going to be spurred on, and sort of the advances are going to quicken once they get a hold of Euclid's Geometry. This is, as I said, the cover of Adelard of Bath's book, and you've got monks, one of them literally holding his hand over his mouth because he's so shocked. And they're being taught geometry, and they're being taught by a woman, which is kind of interesting because women were not allowed to teach, actually. But when people talked about and wrote about the 7 liberal arts, which we covered in the last lecture, they often had an allegory of a liberal art represented by a woman. Adelard of Bath is interesting because he's obviously from Bath in England, and he received sponsorship and academic support from a bishop. And the bishop had purchased for 500 pieces of silver the entire city of Bath from the King of England because it had been destroyed in a battle, and he was allowed to rebuild it in his own way. And so what he did is he rebuilt it as a center of scholarship. And he noted kind of the sharp intellect of one of the local boys there named Adelard, and he sent him to Paris to the cathedral schools where he was to study with the best European scholars. Adelard learned quickly, but he longed for more knowledge than just what was available in Northern Europe. So he would eventually study in Paris, and then travel to the Arab world in search of manuscripts that he could study and translate. And while he was a student in France, he had a vision of two women, one offering riches and fame, the other one offering learning and knowledge. So he traveled in the quest of knowledge to Sicily, Spain, Turkey, Greece, and Italy, and he was one of the earliest European scholars to do this. He learned Arabic in Toledo, Spain, and he sought out manuscripts to translate to Latin, and he became one of the major figures in the transfer of Arab knowledge to Europe. He's going to translate Euclid's Geometry in 1120, and then Al-Khwarizmi, his book of algebra, Al-Jabr, he's going to translate in 1126. And he himself wrote his original manuscript in 1150 called On the Use of the Astrolabe. And that is considered something that sort of revolutionized the Western scholars' understanding of the universe around them, because now they were able to tell time, they were able to calculate dates and time. And so it was not only a navigation tool, but it was also something to decipher the movement of the stars and the planets, which then is going to help you to understand time. Adelard of Bath served as a link between the translation movement and the development of the European universities, and he's going to help establish Oxford University. The other big name is Gerard of Cremona. On the right is his 12th century translation of Al-Zahawi's medical textbook. We had talked about that previously. These are different surgical instruments, and Al-Zahawi was the man who wrote a huge, he spent 50 years writing a volume on surgery and surgical instruments. And Gerard of Cremona felt that the education that he was receiving at the cathedral schools, the 7 liberal arts in particular, was too narrow, and he wanted to go to Spain. He went there specifically in search of something called Al-Majest. And Al-Majest was the Arabic translation of a Greek 2nd century geographer by the name of Ptolemy. And the Arabs translated it and expanded it. And while he was up north, Gerard of Cremona heard that there were copies of this book in Arabic down in Spain, and he wanted to translate it from Arabic into Latin. He ended up in Toledo, and he studied, he worked under the tutorship of Archbishop Raimundo, the man who had started the translation center and was the tutor to Alfonso VI when Alfonso was a child. And Gerard of Cremona translated 71 different manuscripts, including Aristotle, Galen, the Greek physician, and Euclid, the Greek mathematician. He also translated 11 books on Arabic medicine, including the text on surgery that you see on your right, and then also Al-Razi's book of Mansur, which is the medical textbook. You're seeing that on the left, and then Ibn Sina's great volume called the Canon of Medicine. And that translation, the Gerard of Cremona's Latin translation of Ibn Sina, he's showing up in books as Avicenna, of Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine, became the primary medical text in the European universities until the 16th century. His Latin translation of Al-Khwarizmi's Al-Jabr, or algebra, was also the primary mathematical text in universities until the 16th century. And we'll look later at what's up with the 16th century. Why did things change so much at that time? Leonardo Fibonacci of Pisa, he actually came up with something called the Fibonacci scale. And he wrote a book called Liber Abaci, or the Book of the Abacus. Wrote that in 1202, a book of math and a book of the abacus. His father was the manager of Pisa's trade with Algeria. And so as a child, he traveled through Egypt and Syria and Sicily and Greece, and he had Muslim tutors. And he says that he was, and I'll quote this, "I was strongly influenced by the Muslim master who taught me to do math by a marvelous method through the 9 figures of the Indians." Note he's saying 9, so he's not discussing the 0 here, which we talked about before and the importance of that. But he did popularize Arabic mathematics amongst European intellectuals. But not all of Europe was very eager to accept this new math. They preferred the abacus because they were afraid of the magic that they were seeing in what they called the newfangled figures. And there were actually laws passed against using Arabic numerals because they were considered too dangerous and too mysterious. I mean, they just didn't like things that they didn't understand. The Fibonacci sequence, you're probably all familiar with that. This is a shell that was drawn by a Venezuelan architect, Rafael Arui. And the sequences seems easy, but it's not. If you just look at it with your students, basically what you're looking at is 1 + 1 = 2. Then you take the last 2 digits and you say 1 + 2 = 3, 2 + 3 = 5, 3 + 5 = 8. And even the Greeks knew this. They understood this as well. And one of the things that people found out, though, as they started to study the natural world, was the fact that this Fibonacci, or the golden ratio, it's also called, that this golden ratio is everywhere. It's on our faces, it's on our hands, it's on a forest, it's on a shell. So they realized that there is this basic mathematical foundation to creation. So it really was an important change in the attitude towards mathematics. Let's look at Michael Scott, who was called the Wizard of the North. And he was the court physician and astrologer and alchemist to a king called Frederick II, King of Sicily. And we're going to look at him in a moment. And Michael Scott knew Latin, Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew. And he translated a philosophical textbook. He went more on the side of philosophy, as well as translating math and astronomy. But his heart was in philosophy. And he translated Ibn Rushd's commentary, Ibn Rushd being a Spaniard Muslim, on Aristotle, and translated it from Arabic to Latin. And it was considered so revolutionary that by 1210 it was outlawed by the church. And then by 1215 it was outlawed again because people kept on reading it. And then by 1255 they gave up and they said, okay, we'll take charge of this. This is going to be required reading. And it talked about things like the nature of the soul, the nature of creation. And so the church, of course, felt quite threatened at first. The reason he's called Wizard of the North is that he was accused of having his dinners delivered to him by little spirits and spirits from Spain and France. And so people were kind of like, how'd you get that? How'd you get it so fast? And so somebody said, well, he has little spirits delivering it from Spain, obviously. How else would he get his dinner? He's also said to have turned a coven of witches into stone. And one of the things he did is, again, he was in the court of Frederick II, King of Sicily, and he predicted with remarkable accuracy the outcome of military expeditions. And so he was accused of knowing magic as well for that. And then he was also accused of knowing magic because he assisted Leonardo Fibonacci of Pisa with the development of the Fibonacci sequence, a very sure sign that somebody is practicing magic. So let's look at the great scholar kings of Europe. Roger II of Sicily, his grandson Frederick II of Sicily, and Alfonso the Wise. Roger of Sicily was the one who developed an academy of geographers. So I wanted to remind you of this man. He's the one who brought the Arab scholar Al-Idrisi in to weed out all the sort of fables and silly fables and really turn to facts and create a map of the world. Al-Idrisi is also the one who made the silver disc that was melted down by Norman soldiers when they came in and defeated Roger II of Sicily, and they melted it down and used it for cannonballs. So one of the things that Roger of Sicily did is he grew up with Arab tutors, and he was pretty much a scholar in his own right, and he copied Islamic traditions of bringing scholars to the royal court. This is something that had really started with the Beit al-Hikmah way back in the 19th century in Baghdad. But he filled his court with scholars, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars again, and took on the sort of the flavor of Islamic court culture so much that the people who did not like him referred to him as the baptized Sultan of Sicily. So while everybody else was, killing the Muslims and, the heathens, as they called them, or the non-believers, he was actually learning from them and studying with them. I would say even more important is his grandson, Frederick, the second king of Sicily. And this is a painting of him greeting some Arab visitors who have come into Sicily to see him. He's a perfect example of the international mix that ended up ruling Sicily. His father was Emperor Henry VI, King of Germany, and therefore Holy Roman Emperor, through his Hohenstaufen blood. And then his mother was the Norman daughter of Roger II. So he is, of course, the grandson of Roger II. But this lineage that King Frederick II had enabled him to claim for himself the titles of King of Sicily, King of Germany, King of Italy, Holy Roman Emperor, and King of Jerusalem. And he even crowned himself King of Jerusalem because the church said, no, actually you're not. And he said, yes, actually I am. So he crowned himself King of Jerusalem. He took the crown of Sicily at the age of 4, had no education, formal education at all, and yet he became a brilliant scholar. He was excommunicated twice by the Catholic Church. Through his rule, he's Christian, his rule continued to support the cultural shift toward Islamic court culture that had entered Sicily in the 900s, when almost all of Sicily was ruled by Muslims who had taken that island from the Byzantines. There's a couple of important figures in his court. One of them is Michael Scott, Wizard of the North, whom we just looked at. And then also a man named Count Landel of Aquino. You're probably seeing the root of the word Thomas Aquinas here in that last name, because he is the father of who was going to be sainted as St. Thomas Aquinas. And of course, St. Thomas Aquinas was one of the European religious leaders and intellectuals, and he's going to write something called Summa Theologica, which basically says the summary of our theology or a summary of our beliefs, because the Catholics themselves at this time were still arguing over what they believe, what they don't believe, and who are we going to follow, who are we not going to follow. And so St. Thomas finally just said, look, I'm going to summarize everything. And so he did, made the Summa Theologica. And he actually Frederick was very tied in with him closely, of course, because St. Thomas was in his court as a young boy. And Frederick II helped to found the University of Naples and created the first Department of Oriental Studies and Arabic in Europe. And then St. Thomas Aquinas studied there. And this little figure down here at his feet is Ibn Rushd, the scholar, the Spanish scholar and philosopher. Alfonso the Wise, 13th century king of Castile and Leon. And he ended up being pretty instrumental in opening up the University of Sevilla. And he continued this tradition that was started by Bishop Raimundo of bringing scholars into the court. And then again, keep in mind that Alfonso the Wise is, by the way, Alfonso the 10th. And he is sometimes called Alfonso el Sabio, or the Wise, Alfonso the Wise. He was that intelligent and well-educated and scholarly. And he, again, continued this tradition of bringing people into his court to study. And he also declared himself emperor of the two faiths. So he saw himself as emperor of Islam as well as emperor of Catholicism. So he's looking at the two faiths here and putting himself at the top, which is pretty understandable. He wrote the famed Alphonsine star charts or star tables, and they're based on Greek and Arabic sources. And he kind of set the standard for European astronomical studies after that. And in 1254, he was one of the people who started the University of Sevilla. So now we're going to look at scholars within the church. Gerbert of Aurillac, Peter the Venerable, and Robert of Ketton. So Gerbert became Pope Sylvester II. People called him the Naughty Pope. He lived from 946 to 1003 And one of the things that's important to him is he's at least, pay attention to those dates, because Toledo is going to fall to the Christians, to the Christian armies in 1085. So he's before the fall of Toledo, and yet he's one of the earliest scholars to go out and seek out Arab learning. He's credited with reintroducing the 7 liberal arts to the university curriculum of Europe. He was a brilliant astronomer and mathematician, and he was also one of the very first Europeans to actually use the astrolabe, to study it, understand it, and use it. He studied math and astronomy in Cordoba and Sevilla. And one of the things that was popular at that time was what's called armillary spheres, these little models of the cosmos, if you will. There's one in the bottom right corner here. And he built one himself. And there was a French nobleman who went down and met him, and he wrote about the armillary sphere that Pope Sylvester had made. And he studied it, and he said, the North Pole is a little bit off. Excuse me. And then later people figured out that the Tropic of Cancer was almost perfect, and the equator was perfect. It was absolutely correct. There's an interesting story about him. He was accused of learning sorcery from the Arabs by stealing a book from them that was a book of magic. And the Arab magician apparently tried to catch Gerbert, who wasn't Pope yet, he was Gerbert of Aurillac at the time. But Gerbert hid by hanging him by the hands from a wooden bridge. And because he was suspended midway between heaven and the earth, nobody could see him. He became invisible. And so the Arab magician never got his book back from him. He was accused of being an alchemist and a magician because people couldn't figure out how he could do math so quickly. He was also accused of being in league with the devil. And then when he became Pope, the big problem is, what do you do? This is a little bit awkward. We've got a Pope, and people are accusing him still of being a magician. What are we going to do? And he was actually warned that the devil was going to kill him if he preached in Jerusalem. So he didn't. He preached somewhere else. He got ill, and he very conveniently died. So that was very polite, because he then kind of relieved people from an embarrassing situation. And of course, one kind of has to wonder if that was coincidence, or if he really died a natural death. And again, if you want to ask your students, why would people see mathematics as being so closely linked up with magic? People were so freaked out by it because you could do mathematical equations not easily, but a lot faster than you could do them with anything else. And you absolutely could not do them with the Roman numerals. So as I had said in an earlier lecture, ask your students to do very simple arithmetic, like 27 plus 8 divided by 4, and then tell them they have to do it with Roman numerals, and then they'll see why the Arabic numerals, which were actually first originated in India, are considered magic by people. They just couldn't figure out how that could possibly work. Peter the Venerable and the scholar monks of Cluny. Cluny was a place where a lot of the scholarship was taking place. Again, keep in mind the scriptoriums where the monks were translating and writing. And so again, they kind of had a monopoly on scholarly work at the time. And like St. Francis of Assisi within the church, St. Francis of Assisi actually felt that the Crusades were too violent and that maybe we should reach out to the Muslims. And Peter the Venerable agreed with that and spoke against the violence of the Crusades. And he called for the Crusades to be more of a missionary effort. And he said that he felt that the Muslims were ripe for conversion to Christianity because he saw them as just a heresy within Christianity. And the reason he saw them as being ripe for conversion was the primary place of Jesus and Mary within Islam. So he said, we can convert these people. He commissioned the first Latin translation of the Quran and the Hadith, the writings of the Prophet Muhammad, but he did it in order to refute Islam, not because he was feeling particularly generous, but he wanted to use that book to point out the mistakes and the obvious problems with the Quran. But in a way, this was a major leap forward in the study of Islam, because he decided it was time to go to the source rather than the so-called European scholars of Islam. So he traveled to Toledo in the 12th century, and he hired Robert of Ketton, who was not happy about this because he wanted to continue to study mathematics and astronomy, and he saw this as sort of a side trip that he was forced to take. But what's interesting is he, again, wrote the first Latin translation, and I put that in quotes, of the Quran, and he titled it Muhammad the Pseudo-Prophet. And this, unfortunately, remains, that with lots of mistakes and errors, remains the standard translation until the 16th century. One of the things that's going to happen is there's going to be more Christian victories and more Muslim cities falling. So in 1236, you've got the fall of Cordoba and the development of the cult of St. James. And his name is actually James of Santiago in Spanish. So he was called Santiago Matamoros, or the slayer of the Moors. And he became the patron saint of the Reconquista, even though he had died in 44 CE, because someone said, one of the soldiers in the Spanish army said that he had seen the spirit of St. James leading them into war. And so they had a big increase in sort of military interest and military power, and he became, as I said, the patron saint of the Reconquista. His tomb, which is called Santiago de Compostela in Spain, then became a pilgrimage site second only to Jerusalem, and a rallying point for Christians when they got ready for the battle against Muslims. You might also note, you see that word Santiago Matamoros. There is a town in Mexico, which is a very Catholic country, that is literally called Matamoros, or death to the Muslims. In 1248, we see the fall of Sevilla, and then 1248 to 1492, Granada ends up becoming a place where Muslim refugees are going to gather. And the Spaniards let that happen. They thought that was fine because they thought, at least way we got the Muslims concentrated under one place, we can keep them in control. And then there's a large turning point. Here we go. In 1453, twist of fate. The Turks take Constantinople, which is the capital of Eastern Christianity. And that's a major turning point in the fortune of the Muslims in Spain, because this is the first time since 1202 that the walls of Constantinople have been breached. Of course, 1202, you're looking at the Fourth Crusade, when Christians from the West breached the walls and slaughtered the Christians from the East, meaning the Eastern Orthodox Christians. And so that city had been under a huge, huge threat from Rome and from the Roman Catholics. They fell in 1202, and then, excuse me, in 1202, and now they fell again to the Turks. So the Spanish Christians did two very wise things. They panicked and they united, because one of the things they feared, and I think wisely, was they had a fear of a two-pronged attack, with the Turks coming in from the east, from the northeast, and the Muslims coming up from Granada and catching the Catholics and the Catholic armies and Catholic Spain in between the two of them. So, of course, what happens in 1469 is you have Isabella of Castile marrying King Ferdinand of Aragon and uniting much of Spain under them. She is the one who convinced the Pope to declare holy war against Islam, and unfortunately, she also asked for permission and got it to burn Arabic manuscripts. In 1491, they actually built a siege city for the purpose of defeating Granada, and that city was called Santa Fe, or the City of Sacred Faith. They also had a royal edict of expulsion that lasts, you notice this is over 100 years. And they, either Jews and Muslims were allowed to convert to Christianity or get out, or be killed. Those were their options. And so this is the altar in the Royal Chapel of Granada, where they are converting, they're doing a mass conversion of Muslims in this scene over here. And then, of course, you've got 1492, Columbus gets lost and alters world history. And one of the results of a lot of this that's happening is that the world becomes more connected. So just kind of loop back to some of this stuff and then look at where the world is headed. The Reconquista starts in 1492. Columbus's expedition to the Americas is going to set Spain on a colonialist path. There's going to be a rise in European confidence and a sense of superiority, to be honest, in terms of culture, religion, and power. By the 1500s, you're going to have the great ocean voyages of the 16th century. There's your turning point. The great ocean voyages of the 16th century, rise in European confidence. By 1600, you've got the British East India Company started by Elizabeth of England. And in 1602, to compete with them, you've got the Dutch East India Company. This is going to lead to the age of exploration and even more confidence amongst the Europeans who are going to go forth with imperial conquest and slavery and trade and science as well. So they're going to be changing the world. And one of the things that's good about this slide is to ask your students, the world becomes more connected. How is that good and how is that bad? I mean, if they could even put it in present terms of things that happen today and how the world becoming more connected. If someone, if there's something happening politically in one part of the world, somebody can videotape it on their cell phone, send it out, and within seconds, it could be available on the other side of the planet. So this connection can be good and it could be bad. Okay, we're going to finish up with this painting. This is The Ambassadors by Hans Holbein, 16th century, please note. There are two people who are important figures in this painting. On the left is Jean de Vineville. He's the French ambassador to Henry VIII. And Henry VIII at this point is trying to divorce his wife, his Spanish wife, and marry his Anne Boleyn. And he's actually, Henry VIII is on the verge of breaking off from the Catholic Church and creating the Church of England. On the right is Georges de Selve, Bishop of Lavaur. These two young men were very, very good friends. And on the left, you have a sort of a representation of the active life. And you've got this man who's very politically active, etc. And on the right, you have a bishop who is representing the contemplative life. Let's look at the shelves between them. On the top shelf is a lot of stuff that has to do with the celestial world. They've got instruments to read the stars in the sky, and they have a celestial globe. Beneath that, you've got more of the worldly, earthly world. You've got the music, the math, and also a map of the world. So you've got, again, a celestial map at the top, get it, and an earthly map down at the bottom. One of the things to look at is the instruments here, because you've got quadrants that are used to measure altitude. And quadrant, if you can see it, it's right here. Quadrant, of course, coming from the word four, or 1/4, and this is 1/4 of a sphere. So here's a quadrant used to measure altitude. This is interesting. It's a cylindrical sundial, and it is set to London time. Keep in mind, this is in England. This painting was done in England. London time, and it's 4 p.m. on April 11th, 1533, so it is a Good Friday. And you can read all of that by just looking at the details of that instrument. There's what's called a polyhedral sundial over here, and then a torquetum, which is a timepiece and a navigational aid over here. Sort of developed from astrolabes and then kind of got bigger and developed better here. And then again, a map of the celestial skies here. On the lower shelf, you've got an open hymn book, and it's Martin Luther's hymn book. So you've got a reference to the Protestant Reformation and the sort of the problems that are going in the discord that's happening in Europe at the time. There's also a, that's the hymn book over there actually. There's a merchant's arithmetic book on profit and loss over here. You've got the terrestrial globe. And again, that's going to be important when we look at the next slide. And then, no, that's the hymn book because it's right next to the flutes. And there's one flute missing from a set. There's usually a set of flutes and one's missing. So again, you're looking at problems and issues of discord within Europe. And then literally discord, you're looking at a lute with a broken string. So there are problems being alluded to here. Another thing that's interesting is to look at this carpet. Again, this painting was done by Hans Holbein. This is a Turkish carpet, so it's a reference to the real power in the world at that time, being the Ottoman Empire. And because Hans Holbein painted this painting, if you were to walk into a carpet store today that is selling Oriental rugs and you said, I want a Holbein carpet, that's exactly the kind of carpet you would get. That design is still made today and called a Holbein carpet. And what you're looking at here, by the way, is a symbol of building a new Europe. All of this is a symbol of building a new Europe. And the point being here, one of the points being that new knowledge is the key to world influence, and the pursuit of fame and ambition is considered fine. They're proud of themselves. They are young men who are on the cutting edge of the new Europe. Here's another point being made, and that is, what is the Renaissance all about? It's about religion, business, trade, knowledge and scholarship, and cultural exchange. There are some objects here, by the way, that do come from the East. You've got silk and velvet. You've got the scientific instruments, many of them made from manuscripts that came from the East. The lute, that word comes from oud, which is the Arabic word for this stringed instrument. And then, of course, the carpet, being the reference to the Ottoman Empire. You have influence of Islamic scholarship showing up here. You've got the bookkeeping with the Arabic numerals. You've got a new understanding of world geography represented by the globes. And you've got a new understanding of astronomy represented by the navigational instruments. Let's take a look at the terrestrial globe. I've flipped it upside down here because, again, I mentioned in another lecture that the South was often depicted at the top and the North was depicted at the bottom. But if you look at this globe, it's a really strong indication of what's happening at that time, because you're looking at Africa, which, again, the focus of European expansion and imperialism is going to start close to home. And they're going to go into Africa to find salt and gold and slaves. And I believe the last skull, yep, here, the last slide right here has the skull in it. If you were to project this in your classroom, one of the things that you should do is have your students stand off to the side of wherever you're projecting it and take a good look at this. Because sometimes they look at it and they say, well, it kind of looks like a long loaf of bread. It is actually a skull, a human skull. And by the way, the floor is interesting too, because it's an almost perfect copy of the Casmati floor, which is that Westminster Abbey. And it represents the cosmos. And on that floor, it is written, this represents the macrocosm, that floor. Man is the microcosm within the macrocosm. So it's very much of that humanist manifesto that we looked at, with man being at the center of everything. And interestingly, Jean de Vinteville, the man on the left, the one that's representing the active world, a lot of families had a motto, and his motto was, remember, thou shalt die. So it's kind of going against this whole painting of, I'm cool, I'm strong, I'm powerful, I'm young, I'm big, I am well educated, I'm right at the cutting edge of the new Europe. Oh, whoops, I'm going to die. And so he was a very, he really liked the idea of a memento mori, or a memory of death, being sneaked into paintings. So he actually asked Hans Holbein to sneak this skull into here, because he admired the use of memento mori in art. And he said, you know what, we're all going to die in the end, so put that in there. And he did. So I will stop sharing and get back here and remind you that we can discuss these things later. If you have questions, just write them down now and we can cover them when we get together later. And I want to say thank you for joining us, and I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Welcome everyone to day 3. I hope you've had a chance to relax in this time, but also, you know, this is very stimulating discussions that we've had. And the first person I'd like to introduce has been with us every day, participating in our discussions, my colleague and friend, Karima Alavi, co-author on The Emergence of Renaissance, who is going to take your questions on both parts 1 and 2 of the Islamic scholarship and the European Renaissance. So you can gear up your questions for both. I did alter the syllabus because we didn't, you know, we wanted to combine those two since she's doing her lecture on art history tomorrow. So this is kind of the meat of this show me, don't tell me approach to cultural interactions that stimulated the Renaissance in Europe. How did this happen? Where did it happen? So I'm going to turn it over now. We've got a whole bunch of folks flooding in, I'm admitting. So take it away, Karima, and as always, raise your hands in chat and I'll be able to see who is first, second, third, and so on.
Okay.
We also, just before I do, I'm sorry, I just want to also introduce Pamela Smith, who has already come on this morning.
Yeah. All right. Anyway, I want to open it up to questions. But I did want to make a point before we begin, and that is the religious. I tried to make clear the religious support for learning and studying through both the Quran and the Hadith, because that's something that I think is important for your students to understand, is that there's a religious base to scholarship, because we've been talking about scholarship a lot and about manuscripts going along the Silk Road, and I thought it is an important thing to mention to them that there's a religious reason for this scholarship. Okay, but did you guys have any questions or anything that might have stuck in your head while you were? Let me close this curtain. I see this big blob of light. I'm thinking it might be the curtain over here. I don't know. Okay. So anything that kind of struck you as you were going through here? And by the way, I did include Quranic verses in there specifically so you guys could use those in the classroom as well. So you can see on some of the slides, there were verses that, and I should add, there are so many verses in the Quran that use the word reflect and tell people, look around you, think about it, reflect. You know, don't just say, oh, what a lovely sunset. Reflect on who made that sunset and why. You know, so the word reflect is used a lot. So I tried to put some of those verses in the slides for you as well.
And I might add also the word reason, you know, to think and consider and reason, and all of those kinds of ways of not passively viewing the creation, but trying to understand and penetrate.
Yeah, so there was a lot of support
signs.
because of that. There was a lot of support for science and scholarship.
Okay, who's going to kick it off? I'm still waiting for seeing hands go up in the queue.
There is one that.
Okay, yes, Ellen, I see Ellen.
Okay.
I've always stressed in Islam the need for learning and how that was a paramount importance, but I don't see the strictures in Christianity that contrast so deeply with, you know, the Christians were limited in their ability to even discuss thinking. You know, there's such a hierarchy in the Christian model. So I know we're talking about Islam, but I was wondering, can you point me to something where I could show students more completely how this was such a juxtaposition in approaches to knowledge and the ability to even discuss the meaning of God's word?
Yeah, one of the things that many books mention is that there not only was not a support for get out there and study, but there was also, you know, you got the plague because you're a sinner, not, you know, because of a germ that was transmitted to you. And there were, of course, though, Christian scientists who said, hey, wait a minute. So it would be good for you to actually have students search out medieval, in particular, Christian scientists. And then like the alchemists were important in terms of science. I mean, I mentioned Nicholas Flamel, but in terms of like biblical verses that would support and encourage study, I haven't found any, but to be honest, I haven't searched very well, but it might be a nice project for you to just say to the students, find verses within the Bible that encourage study. But the Bible also has verses, though, that kind of encourage you to reflect on things in the sense that it talks about creation and about beauty and grace, you know, and how this is created by God. But what you don't have within Christianity would be an equivalent of the Hadith, where I spoke about the Prophet Muhammad and gave you 3 samples of Hadith or sayings of the Prophet where he said, seek knowledge even unto China. I mean, he was just like, get out there and study. And the other thing that I don't see an equivalent of within Christianity until later when you get to Spain and the translation movement, and then it really kicked in, would be an equivalent of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. And I don't see an equivalent of that in Europe. But although the monks were studying a lot, but they were translating, but they were focusing on religious texts, not, some of them actually did early on. Like I found this group in England, flaking out on their name, I'm having a senior moment, but they actually within a monastery were looking at mathematical texts from the Arabs way before the translation movement in Europe started. So there was a little bit of that, but like an equivalent of Beit al-Hikmah, of go out and find everything you can get a hold of, bring it here. We're going to sort of make this big, bowl of soup and mix all these sciences together. And then this person's going to look at medicine, that person's going to look at math, that person's going to look at physics. That you just don't find. So it kind of took the influx of the Arab texts into Spain to kick that off. And then Bishop Raimundo in Toledo is the one you can really credit with saying, you know what, we need to bring people here and gather together scholars. And one other thing, I know Susan, you wanted to say something, but one other thing I want to point out is to keep in mind China and India and how very, very critical they were in terms of the Beit al-Hikmah, because Chinese and Indian scholarship was brought into the Beit al-Hikmah. So that's a group, you've got Arabs, Persians, Chinese, Central Asians, Hindus. I mean, keep in mind, numbers were called Hindu numbers. The Arabs called them Hindu numerals. So that kind of gives you a hint of where they called them Hindi numerals. So that gives you a hint of where they came from. And then we switched it over to Arabic numbers. We call them to this day Arabic numerals, but the Arabs call them Hindi numerals.
I just wanted to convey what Rob Hardman put in the chat, and then someone else seconded it, about the references in the Jewish sources. Someone here mentioned the Talmud, that also encourage learning. And I wanted to just add to that, one of the most overlooked aspects of looking at early Islamic history and what is often called Islamic science, which Marshall Hudson preferred, as he did of all the cultures, to say Islamicate, because there was such an amount of exchange among people of various religions in the Middle East when Islam expanded into those territories, long before, centuries before, these areas became, majority Muslim. And even after they were majority Muslim, or after the spread of Islam among the people, which certainly wasn't instant, there was this amazing amount of exchange among elites. That's how the familiarity with Greek, that they were some of the early translators, were the secretaries who were Jewish and Christian of various varieties of Christianity. And so that period of intellectual exchange and ferment really gives rise to this, so we have to kind of People just don't think of that because, oh, Islam expanded, bang, you know, they're all Muslim now, but that's not in any way, shape, or form the case.
Yeah,
So
I also, if you look back to the my lecture, when I did Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine, I mentioned in there that I purposely found an image of a Hebrew translation, because I kind of put that in, and I put that in there as a reminder that we need to also remember that there were people, Jews who spoke and wrote in Hebrew, who were part of this chain of transmission, and they were an important part. And then Bishop Raimundo in Toledo, what he did often is he would pull out, let's say, a certain text and say, okay, I want you guys to translate Al-Razi and his medicine, but I want to put together a Jewish scholar, a Muslim scholar, and a Christian scholar. So they made these little groups in Spain in the School of Translation in Toledo that brought in all three of the major of the Abrahamic faiths and said, let's sit down and do this. So, and then of course the other group was the Nestorian Christians that I mentioned when I was talking about the Beit al-Hikmah, that the Nestorian Christians were absolutely critical because they could read and write in Greek. And so, and Syriac. So it went from sort of like Greek to Syriac to Arabic to Latin. So there's, if you really look at the linguistic basis of a lot of this scholarship, you can see who's in there. You can see the Chinese star charts that were then translated into Arabic. So there's, you know, there's a lot of, it's a real sort of, that's why I call it kind of like a big soup. You know, they call it big vegetable soup, and everybody's throwing their veggies in there and mixing it up and then pulling it out again.
we have a question from Kelly Anderson.
Hi, I just want to say thanks so much for a very interesting lecture. First of all, I really liked the intro you gave about how to introduce the Renaissance versus medieval. I'll be using that activity to open the year. And I appreciated in general all the lesson ideas and how targeted it was for teachers, so thank you. So my question was, obviously it seems like there was a lot of, given this translation school and everything in Spain, there's a ton of respect for Islamic learning and Islamic scholars. And I was wondering, the shift from that seems to come after the Reconquista and after Isabel of Spain, but why does that shift for then sort of disrespecting that learning or disregarding it or forgetting it come then when there's also earlier conflicts with the Islamic world, like the Crusades are going on, and yet this respect for learning continues? But then in the fifth, is it just because of Constantinople and it's that like existential threat and now we can't respect learning anymore? Or like, why this conflict? Why does that make the difference as opposed to all the other ones before?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I've been to Spain, and I refer to it as a schizophrenic relationship with Islam. And that kind of started during the Crusades and then was really ratcheted up in 1453 when the Muslims took Constantinople. And you cannot diminish the threat to Spain once that happened. That was huge because they're sort of being surrounded now by Muslims. But if any of you have been to Spain, you know, back me up on this, or, you know, say, no, I didn't see that, whatever. But I found that they had this, today, they had this great reverence for for Islamic learning, for the music, for the tradition, all the traditions that are sort of foundational today in Spain in terms of their culture, and especially the architecture, the art and architecture. But if you're actually a practicing Muslim in Spain, I picked up a little bit of a tension with that. So it was kind of like, we like your history, that's really cool, but we don't like the fact that you're still practicing Islam. So that was and I even mentioned at one point that I have on one of the slides there that Islam is a threat in terms of a cultural threat. You know, I found some of the quotes of people complaining and saying, our young men are, you know, sort of, you know, rising and sort of studying and elevating Islamic literature to the detriment of Christian literature, because it is not only a political threat, a military threat, a religious threat, it's also a cultural threat. And so that attitude, and remember on that one slide, I had this little pop-up where it says, but they have cool stuff we want to buy. You know, then that was, again, sort of this schizophrenic, ooh, you know, we don't want them to have too big of an influence on our culture. And yet I used the term, the Islamic art of gracious living. It was like, but I do like their perfume, and I do like, and it kind of goes on, you know, and I do like this, and I do like that, and I like their instruments, and that oud is beautiful, and their music is lovely, and I love their food. So it's definitely, there's definitely a conflict very early on. But then once in 1453, when the Turks take Constantinople, it's no longer sort of like a subtle conflict. It's like, oh my God, they're in our backyard.
Okay. So just like the Crusades and all that was far enough away that it's not a direct threat, as opposed to, okay, cool. Thank you.
Well, lots of scholars consider the Crusades to have had an arm in the Reconquista. They considered it part of the Crusades. Quite officially. And interestingly, also, when we did the film Sultan and the Saint with Unity Productions Foundation, there were aspects of the crusade that were considered for the Northern European unconverted, who are still, I guess, what they called pagans or heathens or who knows what. So it's not just that, simply the Middle East crusade. The next question is, crusades. Right, still going on. The Joan Brodsky-Shore has a question.
We don't hear you, Joan. Joan, you need to unmute. There we go.
Thank Karima for the richness of these three incredible videos.
Thank you.
So much. I'm working with teachers of 6th, 7th, and 8th grade mainly, and the richness of the physical world is so rich in a way that students can sort of enter into it through the objects and the architecture, as opposed to the ideas, which are a little more abstract at that age. On the other hand, I wanted you to explain or talk a little bit more about the concept of Tawheed, which you reference repeatedly.
Yeah.
And I actually, one of the things I most love about your lectures are your personal reflections on the art, which were so beautiful. And so could you talk about that concept as it refers to this unity of the universe, as it refers to art? And also, does it also reference scientific inquiry, or is it mainly a kind of spiritual, artistic concept or reflection on the world?
Good one. For those of you who have not yet watched the my lecture on art, we're going to be discussing that tomorrow. And Joan's referencing something where I talked about when I would look at a certain work of art and people say, there is no actual representation within Islam. And so in that lecture, I talk about how much was going on in my head about the message of the artwork, even though nothing is being represented here. You might go into a cathedral and see Christ being taken off the cross in a stained glass window. You're not going to see that in an Islamic religious setting. And yet, when I walk into these places, I see a whole lot. And she's talking about one of the things that that I talked about, and that was seeing so much in just a geometric pattern. So I have literally this list that I read. And by the way, I could drop that list right into the box of references too, because I discuss it during the lecture and I've got it actually listed in a reading. But in terms of the Tawheed, one of the things that that you need to think about too is in art and in Islamic art, it is a reflection of Tawheed, or this unity of all creation in many ways. And then so is scientific study, because if you're studying the human body, you would also be studying Quranic references to the human body, like how to take care of yourself. And how I'd mentioned that the Quran even says that there's a healing element to honey, that God created honey and it's a healer. And then it also says, by the way, the Quran is a healer, that, you know, that if you're feeling stressed out, whatever, read the Quran, that's a healer. So you can see this. What's really important is the link between religion and scientific study. That I would say was the foundation of Tawheed. And then also the understanding of how everything is so connected. You know, that if something happens, excuse me, in, like if there's a hurricane in Indonesia, that's going to affect other parts of the world. And it's going to, and even, I would say it's even more so today. I mean, you look at what happened yesterday in Lebanon, you know, during the Renaissance, we wouldn't have known that because there's not people, you know, taking pictures and sending them across the world. So this unity, I would say, is even strengthened in the sense that we know what's going on in so much of the world. But if you're studying the sky, you better study it in ways of how's this reflected in the Quran? What are the verses in the Quran about the sky? And then how does it affect the earth and the crops and starvation and temperature and storms? You know, and so you kind of get, and insects, you know, I mean, there might be something going on that's going to wipe out insects. And we may take that lightly, but you know, it's part of the whole cycle and the whole sort of a tapestry. And if one thing goes, you know, like the big concern right now is bees. You know, if the bees go, we go, we're gone. So, you know, we don't really think of it that way, but if the, you know, that every little piece of the creation is supporting the rest of creation. And so if you're going to be a scientist, for instance, be careful, because if you're going to mess around with something, watch out, because you could at sort of, you know, this Frankenstein kind of science of whoops, you know, wish we could turn that around and go backwards. That was kind of a mistake. So the attitude is, if you study A, think about what's going to happen to B, C, D, E, and F all the way down to Z before you make any changes. You can study it and understand how it's related, but you better think carefully in terms of what your science can do.
Okay, thank you. The next person I see listed here is listed as Sibrel.
Yeah, she had her hand up a while ago.
Thank
Oh,
you.
there you are. It's funny how our pictures move around. I'm like, you know, trying to figure out who's still in the Brady Bunch and who's not.
So you've already kind of danced around part of my question about why the emphasis on like religion and scholarship. But I was wondering kind of, maybe I shouldn't make the comparison, but like with the Christian church, the heliocentric theory was viewed as a challenge to authority and belief. Were there any Muslim discoveries or inventions that were first not well received or viewed as challenges to
Absolutely. Yeah. Keep in mind that in Islam, there's not sort of this this pyramid of power, if you will, like within Christianity, especially Catholicism at that time in particular. There are, you know, the bishops, the archbishops, the pope, so they could sort of make these announcements, fatwa, if you will, of, you know, we're not comfortable with what you're saying about the heliocentric theory because it goes against the idea that man is the center of everything, therefore earth is the center of everything. And again, keep in mind that women were just not even mentioned in these writings. But in Islam, you didn't have that central authority representing all of Islam. So what ended up happening actually is that political leaders would respond to some of the writings. And so I talked about that group, the Brethren of Purity, and they were in a lot of trouble. And their writings got them more into a political problem than, and you don't see that much of people getting in trouble on a religious basis as much as people getting in trouble in terms of politics. And so when it's called the Ikhwan Safa, or the Brethren of Purity. And by the way, they're still around, because I don't know, Susan, if you were around at the Dar al-Islam Institute when Robert Armand from Colorado, architect, was doing art and architecture. And it's funny because I was talking to him and I saw this little tiny pin, and it was the symbol for the Ikhwan Safa, the Brethren of Purity. And and it was really interesting. And he had it like on a little lapel on his shirt, assuming nobody would know what it is, you know. And I looked, and I'm talking to him, and I looked down and I went, you're Ikhwan Safa. And he immediately went like that. And, you know, and it was like, no, and I went, yeah, you are. and so
very strange.
Yeah.
I wasn't there for that, no.
Yeah. So to this day, they're kind of like a sort of a group that's kind of kept quiet, and they do a lot of intellectual studies. He's an architect and he does sacred architecture. So I'm in Colorado. So I'm sure that's how he got into the Ikhwan Safa. But their manuscripts, if you look at my slide, you notice that they were talking about bringing in Christian ethics, you know, and a lot of Greek influence, plus Islamic law, plus, you know, the Islam itself. So they got in trouble for bringing in non-Muslim influences and saying to the government, you might want to pay attention to these people, you know, like the Christians here, because you, dear ruler, have drifted too far. And so let's bring in all these things and, you know, create a more ethical, a better government. And boy, they didn't want to hear that. So those people were literally killed. I mean, they were killed. And so they had to kind of go underground. And then I'd mentioned that their books were burned. So was Ibn Rushd, of Averroes, the Spanish scholar, his books were burned. So there were definitely problems. But I'd mentioned that a Spanish Muslim had gone through Baghdad and had copied all these manuscripts. And so that's the only way we even know that these manuscripts even exist.
And you said it was during the Abbasids, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Umayyad prince had to leave. His family, I call it the dinner party from hell. There was actually a dinner party that the Abbasids held and invited the Umayyads, and then they just slaughtered them at the dinner, after dinner. They like fed them dinner, had a lovely time, and then slaughtered them. So Abdurrahman the First was the one who escaped and took a while, but he went out through North Africa and into Spain. So that's how Islamic rule entered Spain, was through this Umayyad prince who managed to survive. It's quite, you know, Hollywood.
Linda Burns.
Sorry, it wouldn't unmute. So I was going to go back to the question about the shift because of the Reconquista, why the shift then and not earlier. And I was wondering if you thought it might also have something to do with the need for Spanish unification, like this push for religious unification was much stronger once you get the desire to combine Castile and Aragon. And I know that there's a book by George Fredrickson, I think it's called The Short History of Racism, that's about how the development, like how the expelling of Jews and the push for, you know, the conversos and the persecution of conversos led to a more sort of genetic view of race. And I don't know if that also affected their relationship with scholarship in a way that hadn't been before. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out.
That's good. One of the things to keep in mind is that the Muslims made it absolutely so easy for them to take over, because they talk about the taifa, in English, they kind of translated into petty kingdoms. The Muslims became disunified right when Alfonso VI thought, ooh, here's our chance. So he unified the Christians. And then, you know, as time went on, then you had Isabel and Ferdinand getting married, but he unified the Christians because The Muslims were fighting amongst themselves and just absolutely opening the door and just saying, come on in and get it. So I had that poem where that man says, Spain is being ripped down the center, because much of it was their fault. Much of it was. Another thing I wanted to mention too was the expression final solution. When you mentioned racism, I thought, ooh, final solution. I read somewhere that Queen Isabella was the first person to use that phrase. And that, because of course Hitler used it against the Jews, but she used it against Jews and Muslims and said, our final solution is to just wipe them out. So they were either, I mentioned the options: you can convert, you can get out of the country, or you can be killed. And those were your three options. And one of the things also, once Isabella and Ferdinand joined together, and they kind of made this union up at the north and then moved south against the Muslims. One of the things that they did do, though, is they let a lot of the Muslim refugees gather together in Granada. And so that was sort of like the final holdout was Granada. And it is interesting to, if any of you have been to Granada, oh, what? Okay, I was just gonna say, if any of you go to Granada, you can see how that there's this final sort of desperate burst of Islamic art and architecture down there. And I think they knew, I mean, common sense, your days are numbered. And so they made this sort of like this stamp on Granada that said, when we're gone, please remember us. So that's what I picked up when I went to the Alhambra, was a message of please remember us. Susan, were you going to say something?
No, I was just was noticing Rob Hardman came on. Did you want to raise your hand?
No, just I had a question.
Okay.
The question was, we have to make a distinction between what is Islamic art and what is the art of Muslims.
Okay, yeah, because some of it is not very Islamic. It's too. I mean, that's some of the palaces. I talk about that in the lecture for tomorrow, how there is what I call horizontal and vertical art. And if you're at the top of the social structure, don't tell me they don't have representational art. Give me a break. It's all over the place. So you can pour your wine, which they did, which they're not supposed to do. But there's even wine ewers, that are just, you pour it and you look and there's all these beautiful carvings of animals and polo games and court scenes. So there is art under the Islamic tutorship as well. And one of the greatest things to look at is the Christian influence on what is probably the most famous, architecturally the most famous city in the world, which is Isfahan in Iran. And it is the blue tile work on those. Well, you'll see it in the lecture for tomorrow. The tile work and the glazing is just absolutely unbelievable. That was done by Armenian Christians, not Muslims, who were forced by Shah Ismail, who is a Shia ruler in Iran, and he wanted to bring in artisans to make Esfahan, sort of make a statement with Esfahan. The nickname of Esfahan, when you go there, they say Esfahan Nesfajahan, which means Esfahan is half the world. Which, okay, it's a little bit of a hyperbole, but he wanted to make a city that reflects his power and the beauty of Islamic art and architecture. And who does he bring in? Christians. So the Armenian tile makers had no choice. He had literally defeated parts of like Georgia and parts around on the outskirts of Iran and forced these Armenian Christians to come into Esfahan. And he gave them a part of the city called Jolfa and said, this is your part of the city. Make your own cathedrals. They made the Cathedral Vank there, V-A-N-K. Look it up on the web. It's unbelievable. It's really amazing. But he said, you can make your own cathedral, but in the meantime, you are also going to help build the Islamic the mosques, the masajid here, and they're gorgeous. But you know, a lot of people look at that and say, "Oh, Islamic art," and I'm like, "Yeah, but it was made by Armenian Christians." It's just not the actual foundational design, but the cover of it, you know, the tiles. So it was it's kind of an interesting city to look at. So that's why I picked that for my lecture on Islamic art and architectures.
And not to forget the Armenian role in the silk trade, the Armenian networks for the silk trade. But I wanted to also remind us that takes us back to the Broughton chapters we discussed on the first day, where he talks about the period, that the early modern period, as being this time when the borders between East and West were not as fixed as the 19th century later portrayed them as, but that they were looking at each other's architecture and emulating features that they liked, and portraiture and all of those things that were brought together in his chapter. So the fixation, and this refers back also to the amnesia that Rosa Maria Menokal mentions about Spain, the amnesia about the contribution or the, you know, what do you call, conscious or schizophrenic amnesia, as you put it, or bipolar. So these distinctions simply were not the same. There's one of the readings that you can buy at the Smithsonian Sackler Gallery talks about the Italian art of inlaid stone, the pietra dura, that is part of the decoration of the Taj Mahal. And there were Italian artisans, and they're arguing back and forth. Was it the Mughals, or was it the Mughal artisans or the Italian artisans who invented pietra dura, this inlaid precious, semi-precious stone? So I think that's our takeaway here, is again, in Connected Histories of the Renaissance, is that these borders were only retrospectively viewed as this, you know, hard stop between Orient and Occident.
Yeah, and also I live in Abiquiu, New Mexico, and right behind my house and up the mountain is the Dar al-Islam Mosque, which is the biggest adobe building, the biggest adobe structure in the United States. Joan's been there. And and one of the things that's interesting is that Kodak, they had come up with a new camera about, in fact, I think it might have been their first, what's it called? The camera that we use today, I can't think of the word for it, without the film, you know, where you don't have to, in the olden days, for those of you who are too young, digital, thank you. In the olden days, we actually used to have to take our film and get it developed to see our photographs, way back in the olden days. But they had a contest, and they gave their digital cameras out to people and had a contest, and the guy who won had taken photographs of Dar al-Islam, but he said when he projected his images up on the screen for this contest, for this competition, everybody said, you were told you have to take photographs in the United States. It's so obvious that you went to North Africa. Give us a break. And he's like, no, actually, this is Abiquiu, New Mexico. And so they really had to check him out, because they just said, you cheated. You went to North Africa and got these beautiful, stunning, you know, arches that are sort of going down the hallway there, and, you know, the mosque itself and the dome. And they're like, give us a break. You know, you cheated. And he's like, no, I was in New Mexico.
Well, talk about itinerant. The architect for that is an Egyptian who's trying to revive the traditional architecture.
Now, I wanted to reiterate a comment I made of how important it is to cover this stuff in your classroom, because we all have Hispanic students in our school. And they have no idea what their traditions are. It's just been wiped out of the curriculum, and they have no idea. And another thing that's kind of interesting is I lived close to a town called Española, New Mexico. And when you're driving around there, Karina, you're nodding there, yeah. When you're driving through that town and you see the sort of town hall center, it looks like you're in Morocco. There's these little arches, there's archway, and I mean, it just looks like you're coming right into Morocco there.